Welcome to Cheese in Depth. I'm Michael Landis, and today's webinar is sponsored by the Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin. With over 1,200 licensed cheesemakers in the only state that requires a license to make cheese, they're also the only place outside of Europe that a Master Cheesemakers program. Today, I'm talking with Andy Hatch, who is a licensed cheesemaker. Andy was born in Wisconsin and studied dairy science at the University of Wisconsin, where he apprenticed under master cheesemaker Gary Grossen. After apprenticing in Norway, France, Italy, and England, Hatch returned to Wisconsin to run and eventually purchase Uplands Cheese, a dairy farm in Dodgeville, where he now lives, milks cows, and makes two cheeses, Pleasant Ridge Reserve and Rush Creek Reserve. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy. Andy, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. And I really was flattered that you asked me to be part of this. I know we've done so many of these in person over the years, and now that we're into a new era, I'm glad we're going to continue via Zoom. And thanks to those of you tuning in, whether it's live or via recording later on. I'm here in our barn in Dodgeville in Wisconsin, and as unusual as it seems maybe to talk at a computer for the next 45 minutes, I'm really glad to know that on the other end are so many people interested in cheese, and that we're finding ways to continue to connect, and that's been really important for me, as isolated as I am, to stay in touch with the people out there who buy and sell and eat our cheese. And I understand from Michael that some of the attendees work in the cheese industry, and some of you are simply people who enjoy cheese and are interested in learning more about it. So what I think we're hoping to do today is give you guys an overview of our operation, tell you about what we do, how we do it, why we do it, and taste some of our cheese together, and handle any questions that you'd like to submit through Michael. I'm happy to talk about just about anything. So please, let it fly with questions. Great. Michael's going to cue up a short video here. For those of you who have not visited our farm, I thought it was useful before I start describing what we do for you to have a sense of what that actually looks like. So this is a 4.5-minute video that'll at least give you a sense of the landscape here, and kind of the scale at which we do things. So let it rip, Michael. Not many people have the chance to work with milk from a single herd, let alone milk that is raw and from fresh pasture and just minutes old. And so making Pleasant Ridge really is just a matter of getting out of the way and setting the right conditions so the milk itself can shine. Making cheese with our milk requires a certain amount of sensitivity, because as the cows move through the pasture and the milk changes, you need to constantly make little adjustments in the vat to stay in tune. And it's one of the reasons I like making cheese 7 days a week in the season, because even a day or two away seems to dull your touch. And with milk like this, you've got to really stay in step. We move the cows into a new pasture every day, so each batch of cheese comes off of a different piece of ground, and its character will be really determined by that. And so as we age these different batches and watch them reveal that character over time, it feels a little bit like watching children grow up. You wonder what they're going to be like, you get excited about their potential, then all of a sudden they're ripe, you're proud of them, and then they leave home. But we spend a lot of time with our cheese. We wash every wheel every week, and they end up being good company in the winter months. Okay. Thanks, Michael. I feel a little bit like the substitute teacher who just put the movie on and leaned back in my chair. But like I said, I think for those of you who have not been here, and those of you out there selling our cheese, we'd love to have you visit someday. But hopefully that video gave you a sense kind of what it looks like here, how we milk cows and make cheese. And I'd like to go a little bit deeper into that now and lay out for you kind of our approach to dairy farming and cheese making. And that I think then will lead us into some cheese tasting. And Michael and I talked in advance of this session about a couple of different topics to touch on, and so Michael, feel free to interject wherever you see a chance, and to harvest questions, and I'm happy to kind of go down any rabbit hole you guys would like. But where we begin as a business, as a farm, is with the concept of grazing dairy cows on fresh pasture. That is really the center of everything that happens on our farm, and cheese making is an extension of that. That's I think stands in contrast to say a business who simply makes cheese and tries to come up with new flavors of cheese to, fit a niche in the market or round out their portfolio. And those are certainly reasonable ways to behave as a cheese business. But our strategy is to make a cheese that tastes like our farm, which I know sounds like just brochure copy, but really it is our competitive strategy to survive as a small producer, because we will never at our scale achieve the efficiencies to compete in the market based on price or marketing budgets or so rather than make cheese that the market would consider generic, a cheddar or a Gouda, and be out there competing with all the other producers, we instead try to make something that is unique, could only be made by the land, the animals, and the people here. So that when you do buy our cheese, Pleasant Ridge or Rush Creek, you're supporting a particular character. You're supporting, the cheese you like, the flavor, the texture. They can't be found elsewhere. And so I think it's not a novel idea for small producers to try to be unique. But what does that mean in terms of an artisan cheesemaker? How do you make a cheese that tastes like your farm? It's easy to say that. We all talk about terroir, but really, how does that happen? And in the case of our operation, it all begins with pasture and with our cows. And Michael, if you're able to share the screen here and click to the slide that shows our cows out in the field, that would be useful. So actually, I'm standing here in our barn. This barn is I'm standing right above the milking parlor. This barn is about 100 years old. Actually, it had its 100th year anniversary last year. And so cows have been milked on this farm for some 130, 40 years. But like a lot of ridgetop farms, it's struggled and changed hands every generation or two. Our farm is up on top of Pleasant Ridge. The cheese is named after the farm. Thanks, Michael. That's a good slide. So I'm sitting just under those. I'm standing just under those 3 windows up in the peak of the barn. When everything ground to a halt in March, we decided to build out an office up in the haymow. So cows have been milked here for a long, long time, but the farm did not prosper really until the 90s, when the 2 families that we bought it from, the Gingriches and Patnaws, planted the entire 300-acre farm to permanent pasture and started grazing the cows outside on pasture, allowing the cows to harvest their own feed and spread their own manure. All of the previous generations of families that farmed here farmed like pretty much everybody else did. Keep your cows in the barn year-round. Use machinery to grow as many crops as you can. Harvest those crops, store them in sheds, bring them to the cows in the barn to feed the cows. Then harvest all the manure from the cows in the barn, use machines to spread it out on the fields to fertilize the fields. And you try to, achieve a balance and an efficiency that way. And if your goal is to make as much milk as possible for as low of a cost as possible, that is, right now in today's market, probably the best way to do it. And that's why most people do it that way. So why in the mid-90s, 94, did they decide to plant this whole farm into pasture? A couple of different reasons. First of all, grazing animals on pasture is not a new concept. I mean, it is as old as, animals and grasslands themselves. You think of bison moving through the prairie, or antelope, zebra in African grasslands. There's a natural symbiotic relationship. The grasslands will support the animals, and the animals in turn with their manure build fertility and maintain grassland. What changed in the 80s and 90s was the advent of electric fencing, and that all of a sudden allowed farmers to reshape their fields and intentionally move cows to different patches of ground very easily and quickly. So now, instead of turning cows out into a big open field, which is not the optimum way to feed a cow or nourish the soil, now you could manage the herd, manage the grazing in a way that gives the cow enough nutrition and supports soil health and plant regrowth. So, the main appeal of rotational grazing, as it's called, in those days, this was the very earliest introduction of that style of farming in this country. The guys we bought the farm from were some of the first in the Midwest to do it. The appeal was, okay, it's better for the animal. She's meant to be outside eating grass. It's better for the land instead of constantly plowing it, making, disturbing soil structure and releasing carbon and losing soil to erosion when it's plowed. And, permanent pasture is better. I think everybody can agree, for water quality, soil health, carbon sequestration. So it ticked the boxes environmentally, it ticked the boxes for animal welfare. And also importantly, this part of the state, southern Wisconsin, especially these hills in the southwest corner of the state, are really meant to grow grass. Historically, ancient history, well, 10,000 years ago plus, this was all grassland, oak savanna. Whereas south of here would have been prairie, down through Illinois and Iowa, and north of here, just 60, 70 miles north of here, it would have been all forest. So this farm was well suited to it. It was a new, idea of how to raise dairy cows in an environmentally sensitive way, better for the animal. And lo and behold, the milk coming off of fresh pasture was unbelievably flavorful. And that was a realization that happened on this farm in the late 90s. But of course, that has been known for hundreds of years in the Alps and other mountain regions around the world where, for 900 some years, shepherds take cows up into the mountains to graze summer pastures and turn that milk into aged mountain cheeses. And this is where Beaufort and Gruyere and Comté have their roots. So the idea to make an Alpine style cheese here, to make a cheese like Pleasant Ridge Reserve, began with the choice to graze cows on pasture, and was linked by the concept, from the old world, from the Alps, that grass-fed milk makes sublime aged cheese. And I can talk in a little bit about, why it's better suited for aged cheese than, say, soft cheese, grass-fed milk. And so when I say that the cheese making here is sort of an extension of the way we farm, that's what I mean. I mean, our commitment here is to grazing cows on pasture. And the flavor from our cheese, extends from that. But it begins with, a commitment to the environmental aspect of grazing, the animal welfare aspect of grazing, and all of that. The third leg of the stool is supported by the economic return from the flavor of that milk. And that's, I think, what makes it such a special system, is that it's good for the land, it's good for the animal, and lo and behold, it's delicious. I think so often indulgences in our world, in our lives, come at the expense of something you'd rather not acknowledge. Like, oh my God, that's delicious, but we'd rather not think about how it's made. It comes at the price of something that, all right, well, maybe it's worth it because it's really delicious. But in the case of a farming system like this, it's win-win-win. So that's kind of at the root of what we do. And if Michael, I know I've asked you third time, sorry to be demanding. But if you bring up the rotational grazing slide again, it'll show our herd, which is about 180 cows. And it'll show you kind of some of the northern hills on the north side of our farm. The farm is 300 acres, and the entire 300 acres is planted into pasture. And so, that's what it takes in this part of the country, really, to feed a cow throughout the season on pasture. 1.5 to 2 acres per cow. And, if as grass-fed milk meat has become stylish thing to call your product, I think that's a useful thing to keep in mind is how much grass does it actually take to form an animal's diet? So the people who claim that grass-fed milk and they have 600 cows and 40 acres of pasture, that's an exercise lot. That's not feeding an animal pasture. So the entire farm is planted into pasture, and our cows are milked twice a day, like most dairy cows, morning and evening. And so they will move out. They'll come back to the barn, which is in the middle of the farm, to be milked in the morning, and then go out to a fresh pasture for the rest of the day. Come back to the barn to be milked in the evening, go out to a fresh pasture. So each of those 12-hour grazing sessions requires about 5 acres of pasture. And once the grass comes up in the spring, we start making cheese. We make cheese 7 days a week, as long as the grass holds out. It's essentially a season-long harvest of that grass-fed milk. Distill all that pasture down into milk, distill the milk down into cheese, and then age the cheese and distill the flavor even more. And so a year later, you're tasting about 10 acres of pasture from one day in the previous summer. So when I talked in the beginning about our cheese tasting like our farm, that concept, distilling pasture into milk, into cheese, into an aged cheese, that distillation is what I'm talking about. I mean, you have a single herd of cows with raw milk coming from fresh pasture. Those cheese-making principles will always give you cheese that is as direct of a reflection of the animals in the land as possible, for better or for worse. Single herd raw milk, from fresh pasture, from particular land, particular animals, unpasteurized. You're going to taste the farm, which again, as I said, is why we do what we do. That is our kind of strategy as a business. And so from there, I can unpack that concept a little more. I can talk some about raw milk and why that's important. I can talk about grass-fed milk and why that's important. I can talk about our particular breeds of cows and what kind of influence that brings. And lastly, I can also talk about how we age the cheese. All of these components that create a cheese that tastes like a farm. I'm happy to kind of take a dive down any of those tunnels. But maybe it's a good chance to pause, check in with Michael, and see if any particular prompts that you'd suggest, Michael.
We're good right now. Everything's just, listening along, no questions at this point. So
good.
Looking at the slides, the next thing that we have coming up is the cheese making. So why don't we move on to the cheese making portion?
Great, thanks. If you can, picture, and you don't need to bring it up, thank you, Michael, but the first slide, you saw the picture of the barn, and the farmhouse is right next to it, and then right in front of the barn is a one-story building. That's the creamery. It's about 75 feet from the barn. And as I said, we make cheese 7 days a week, and that's just a commitment to always using fresh milk. And so the evening milk is held in the bulk tank in the barn, like on any dairy farm, a big, enclosed stainless steel bulk tank. And the morning milk will be pumped into that bulk tank, but it won't be chilled. It'll come in, cow temp, 100 degrees, mixed with the evening milk, which has been chilled. And when they're done milking the last cow in the morning, we get, the high sign through the window, and open a valve, and that milk flows straight through underground. Gravity flows right down into the vat. So half of that milk is minutes old, and the other half is about 12 hours old. And as I may have said in that video, as a cheesemaker, starting your day with warm, raw, grass-fed milk landing in your vat it's like starting on third base, essentially. You just need to not screw it up. So, I think about cheese making really as happening in sort of three distinct phases. The first of which is the milk you're working, how the milk is produced. Are you working with milk that has some interesting character to it to begin with? Breed and feed. Is it pasteurized? Is it raw? Is it fresh? Is it old? Has it been knocked around through pumps and hoses and tanks? The second phase would be this, 8-hour period when you transform liquid milk into solid curd, the cheese making itself. And then the third stage is the ripening of that cheese. Are you ripening it in a way that's going to actually bring the potential flavor to expression? I came through the dairy science program at the University of Wisconsin here in Madison. Wonderful program. And I learned a lot about cheese making technology, about what happens in the vat and in the press. And I also studied dairy farming in school. You learn a lot about what happens in the barn and in the udder. But what makes our operation a different than most American operations, I think, and it's not to say better or worse, but what makes us a little unusual is the amount of effort and resources we put into the bookends of this process, producing milk with character and then ripening cheese to express that character. I think a lot of modern cheese making, which is, and this mentality is essential, I think, at scale. If you need to make a lot of cheese, you're going to pasteurize the milk to make it consistent and homogeneous. You're going to need to nail it in the make room, and you're not going to be able to ripen it with a natural rind. You're going to ripen it in a plastic bag, if at all. So I think that mentality, focuses on the techniques of transforming milk into curd, and pasteurized milk into curd, and adding a select set of starter cultures that are going to generate a predictable set of flavors and aromas. Make the cheese, pack it in a plastic bag, tuck it in a cold warehouse, and you'll get a consistent, predictable set of characteristics: flavor, aroma, texture. And that essentially, is modern cheese making. And if I were running a big cheese factory, that's how I would do it. And I have nothing against that, that approach to, if you're making pizza toppings, that's how you do it. Our approach is almost the opposite. And instead of producing, consistent, homogeneous product at scale, we're trying to produce complex, distinctive product. And I mean, we're not obsessed with the idea of being small, but putting that kind of attention into the cows and the ripening, it's almost impossible to do it at scale. So when I show you a couple of slides here about our cheese making, I want to first frame that out, that what you're going to see is that 8-hour period here of transforming milk into curd, and the beautiful photo of the cheesemaker leaning over the vat, and it's like you say it in a whisper, like the touch of the master's hand. And yes, you need to be very good at what you do in the make room, and we take it very seriously. But the way I think about what we're doing here, that period of time in the make room transforming milk into curd is mostly about technical accuracy. You're trying to acidify and dry down the milk, form the curd, acidify it, and send it into the cave the next day with a certain amount of moisture, fat, pH, and then you're going to apply salt. Those sort of basic characteristics of a fresh piece of cheese, pH, salt, moisture, fat, are going to create the conditions that you know are going to create the conditions that will make the microbes during ripening behave in certain ways and thus generate certain flavors and aromas. So what we do in the make room is really just setting up those basic conditions. The story largely has already been written. That flavor is already latent in the milk, and the ripening is there to bring it out. But what we do making cheese is not creating flavor, at least not the way we approach it here. We're trying to emphasize the flavor in the milk itself, as opposed to dumping it into the vat from a pouch of commercial starter culture. So now that I've just totally denigrated the whole cheese making process, why don't we take a look at it? Michael, if you'd cue up a couple of the cheese making slides, please. This, to give you a sense of scale, again, is one vat, so that holds about 9,000 pounds of milk, about 1,000 gallons. Again, we have about 180 cows, so that's the 2 milkings. Above my right shoulder, you see that stainless steel pipe dropping down from the ceiling. That's the milk line, and you can kind of tell it's in a loop there, a U-shaped curve. So when they're done milking the last cow, we simply unhook one of those clamps at the base of the U, the shoulder of the U, open it up, and the milk drops straight down into that vat. So what we're doing here is cutting the vat. It's been coagulated with rennet, and now we're dragging the cheese harps through to snip it into little curds. You got a quick look there at the curds in my hand. They're small curds. This is a relatively dry cheese. You want to remove a lot of moisture from the curd, and as opposed to, say, Rush Creek or Brie or Camembert, which would have big, juicy, soft curds. Alpine style curds are pretty dry and small because they're going to create a dry cheese. So on the left side, you see, that happened at about 1 o'clock today. The milk was coming over about 8. By about 1, we're packing it into the forms. You see they're putting a lid on, and they'll stack into that press I'm standing next to. And so those will be pressed overnight. And then the next day, the next morning, brought into the first cheese cave, and you see me there dry salting. So the curd, a wheel of cheese. I'm standing next to a rack. That rack holds 1 day's production. So we make, in this time of year when the cows are in peak production and the pastures are, lush, and we're making 90 wheels a day. So when I talked about that distillation, you think about 10 acres of pasture, 9,000 pounds of milk, 900 pounds of cheese, 90 wheels, which will then, as they age, lose another 10% of their weight. That's that kind of distillation, concentrating of flavor and character. Now we're into talking about affinage, and this is the third of the 3 kind of stages of cheese making that I mentioned. And I talked about how the cheese tastes like our farm because it's a single herd of cows with grass-fed milk that's unpasteurized. So I think the 4th tenet of place-based cheese making of terroir is a natural rind of some sort. That is another way to interact with the environment. and give your environment a chance to create character in the product. I think of terroir really as something you ought to be able to see under a microscope. I think of it as the ways in which microbes create a character of a product, whether it's wine or sauerkraut or sourdough bread. All of these fermented products, the real work is done by microbes. In the case of cheese, yes, the fermentation of the milk, the lactose, during the cheese making process is done by lactic acid bacteria, which are there either from the raw milk itself or as an added starter culture. Once that fermentation is complete, which in the case of a cheese like Pleasant Ridge happens, at night while the cheese is in the press, the fermentation just glides to a halt. All that lactose has been converted to lactic acid. Now, into the ripening rooms, into the cheese caves, you're sending basically just a clump of fat and protein. And the microbes now can go to work on that fat and protein and break it down, metabolize it into its component parts, fatty acids, amino acids. And those fatty acids, amino acids are what become flavor and aroma. And that's why, the longer a cheese is aged, the more intense and complex it becomes, because those fats and proteins are being further metabolized. You're isolating more different fatty acids and amino acids. So how does place-based cheesemaking show itself here? Well, by harvesting microbes and allowing them to play a role. And so in the case of, say, a pasteurized cheese, and the day after it's made, it's cryovac in a bag, you've not allowed any native microflora to arrive on the scene and metabolize fats and proteins in certain ways to generate flavors. You're relying instead exclusively on commercial starter cultures. And again, I don't think that's a wrong way or a less worthy way of making cheese. If you're going to operate at a large scale and require consistency, that's the way you do it. And if I ran a big cheese factory, that's the way I would do it. But if you're trying instead to harvest complexity, you want all the tools in the toolbox available to you. So rather than rely on 3 or 4 strains of commercial starter culture, you want to bring into the scene all of the native microflora available to you via the milk and via the natural rind, and in our case, the brine we use to wash our cheese. So the brine, this is, for our cheeses, both Rush Creek and Pleasant Ridge, kind of the secret sauce, I would say, and it's distinctive to our cheese caves. Like a sourdough starter, it's something that's kept and recycled. And so you use it to wash older batches and then use that same brine to wash younger batches of cheese, just like a sourdough starter is used to re-inoculate fresh batches. And this passes on that set of microbes, distinctive to our cheese caves and our brine. And so it's something that has to be managed, obviously, in terms of food safety and in terms of its influence on the character of your cheese. So we send in samples of that brine every single week to make sure that there's nothing problematic growing in it. You look for dangerous organisms, Staph aureus, E. coli, Listeria, etc. And then every once in a while, we'll spend the big bucks and catalog every bacteria in the brine, or we'll do the same on the rind. And there is several dozen species of bacteria alive on that rind and helping to metabolize those fats and proteins of the cheese and create character. And so this, just like I said, like using unpasteurized milk and milk from a single herd that's grass fed. This harvesting of the environmental microbes and bringing their influence to bear during the ripening is part of the same mentality of making place-based cheese, terroir-driven cheese. And it's something, like I said, that it's not done easily at scale. Ripening cheese like this, it takes a lot of effort, and every one of these wheels is washed by hand in a brine solution. Gosh, at least 75, 100 times, depending on how old it is. Every day when it's young, then every other day as the rind forms, and twice a week, and eventually once a week, but at a minimum once a week for the entire 10, 12, 14, 18 months that it's aged. Which is, this is the old-fashioned way of ripening cheese. Before, cryovac bags existed, this was how you formed a rind on a cheese that would protect the cheese and, allow you to transport it. And, over 900 some years of R&D, trial and error, ripening cheese this way, we've learned how to manipulate the rinds to create certain flavors and aromas. And so it's no longer just a sort of a crude preservation technique. It's really a craft unto itself. And we don't do it that way because of nostalgia or because it's old fashioned. I mean, if there were an easier way to achieve the kind of flavor complexity we want, send me an email. I would love to know about it. But you simply can't. You can't. It's one of those food production techniques, those ancient techniques that you really you can't shortcut, without losing character. So that brings us to kind of the end of a life cycle of a batch of Pleasant Ridge. It's cows have been milked, cheese has been made, cheese has been ripened. Now what? Well, this now is, probably for me, my most interesting part of what we do, or maybe the most rewarding. Milking cows twice a day and making cheese 7 days a week in the summer is a lot of fun in a way that, going out and running 5 miles or going for a long bike ride is fun. I mean, it's physically demanding, and you get the satisfaction of making something with your hands every day. And then in the fall, when the grass stops growing, starts snowing, we stop milking our cows and stop making cheese, and you get the whole farm kind of takes a big exhale, and now we start tasting this season's cheese. We really don't spend a lot of time we don't taste Pleasant Ridge until it's 6-7 months old. So the very first cheeses, May cheeses, are not really tasted until December. But during these winter months, we're constantly tasting these batches, at least every batch once a month, and you watch them develop flavor and character. And that to me is the most, I think, like I said, interesting and gratifying part of it. All of the batches will develop character that's slightly different because they're coming from a different 10 acres of pasture, because the weather changes throughout the season, and because we've opened the process up to those variables, and we don't, I think, celebrate variability for variability's sake. Again, what we're after is complexity, but along with that comes a certain amount of variability. I think there's a pretty direct analogy here with winemaking, in that wines made with minimal intervention tend to be more complex and nuanced, but also vary more vintage to vintage. Whereas wines made at a mass level, blended and manipulated, you can kind of just knock them out same year to year. So in the case of cheese making like Pleasant Ridge and other aged raw milk cheeses, you see that variability, and it's, for me, it's like spending the winter looking back at a history book of the season before, and each production day kind of reveals its own story, or it feels kind of like watching children grow up. I think I said that in the video. You're watching it grow and change, and so the name of the game for Pleasant Ridge is to sell each batch sort of at its sweet spot. Once it's kind of all grown up and is going to say what it has to say and come to its full expression, then you sell it. And that happens at different points for different batches. Some batches we'd sell as young as 8 or 9 months old. The cheese we're selling right now, and if any of you have bought cheese to taste today's part of this, there's a good chance the cheese you bought is about 9 months old. We've been selling lately cheese from last August, which is relatively young for us, but we might age it. Typically, we'd sell 10 to 14 month cheese. It's kind of a most common wheelhouse, but some batches we'd age up to 18, 20 months. And those particular batches we release in the fall as extra aged Pleasant Ridge. But we tapped a vein of just, I think, spectacular cheese from last August that has just loads of character already at 9 months. And it's got a really kind of seductive, fudgy texture that we're in love with. And rather than continue to age it and dry down that texture, we want to send it out into the world now and share it. There's some really nice cheese out there. So hopefully some of you have a piece of cheese with you. I've got one here, and from it I cut a little wedge. Some of you maybe not accustomed to tasting cheese. If you've just pulled it from the fridge, you'll want to try to warm it up a little bit, and that's what I'm doing here. Just smushing it between my fingers. This will help warm it up a little bit, and it'll also release some aroma from the cheese. Give you a chance to smell it a little better. This is just like, swirling wine in your glass. So like the other classic Alpine cheeses, Beaufort, Gruyere, Comté, Pleasant Ridge, when it's ripe, ought to have a combination or an interplay of savory and sweet flavors. And I think that's what makes this style of cheese so compelling. We all love sweetness, and there's a lot of sweet cheese out there. It just tastes like a butterscotch candy or toffee. Sweet, salty, kind of gummy. It's appealing, obviously, for a lot of reasons. You also have we love things that are savory, meat broth, toasted meat, nuts. But the interplay between sweet and savory is, I think it's one definition of complexity, and that really should be the hallmark of an aged raw milk cheese is that kind of that complexity. And the flavors ought to resonate in your mouth after you've swallowed the piece of cheese. That's what we call length, or a long flavor. And as a young cheese, as a relatively young Pleasant Ridge, this has its sort of lower register base of savory flavors that you'd expect. And at 9 months old, those savory flavors remind me of a chicken stock or something. It fills your mouth with kind of round, warm flavors. As our cheese is older, 14, 16 months, that savoriness can take down what we call like roasty, toasty flavors. Roasted nuts or roasted meats will become a little stronger of savory flavor. Likewise, I think the sweetness that you find in this is fruity, but it's a round fruitiness as opposed to like a kind of a piercing sweetness, like a pineapple or papaya, you know, a very like laser beam type sweetness. This is more diffused, malty sweetness. Um, and so this is what I call a really round cheese. Those warm chicken broth flavors and malty sweetness kind of fills your mouth with nice round flavors, as opposed to more, you know, pokier flavors like the bitterness of a sharp cheddar or the piercing sweetness of a very aged 2-year-old Pleasant Ridge. And you know, again, the texture that we're seeing in these August cheeses is kind of what I call fudgy. You can sort of smush it between the tongue and the roof of your mouth, and it you know, you can work it into a nice creamy paste. And this is a shift in the way we've been making and releasing Pleasant Ridge over the last years. Is you know, coaxing it back to a kind of more toothsome, fudgy texture, as opposed to, you know, a drier, more granular texture, which I think, you know, the 2016, 17, 18 Pleasant Ridge had pretty granular texture, and that can be what you want, certainly what you know, what you'd expect in a 2-year-old cheese like a Reggiano or something that's concentrated and salty, breaks apart in your mouth in little bits. You only want to nibble on it, or you can grate it. But you know, Pleasant Ridge, I think, is often delicious at this age, 9-10 months, and that granularity, that shorter bodied texture, you know, I think robs you at 9 or 10 months of that really smooth, seductive mouthfeel. And so we've kind of been coaxing the texture back towards that fudginess a little more. And so those of you in the industry who taste our cheese regularly may have noticed that already, and you should continue to expect to see that in the future.
Mary has a question. She wanted to know when your cheese that you're tasting was made.
I'm tasting a cheese from August 29th, very late August, almost my birthday.
It also is an award winner. Is that correct?
Yes, it's won quite a few awards over the years. Yes, it's been named the best of show cheese by the American Cheese Society 3 different times, which is a record. And it's won a you know, smattering of other awards, and that doesn't sort of naturally fall into my a presentation like this by default. You know, we're flattered by that kind of recognition. Obviously, it's nice, but I don't know. We think of you know, I talked about how every batch is different and every season certainly is different. We're always thinking about this year's and next year's cheese. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about last year's cheese or last year's awards, which I mean, part of the reason I love farming is because of that constantly newness. You're living in real time.
Yeah. Well, I decided that I would pair this up. Obviously, we have done many pairings together over the years and have had a chance to do many different things. So one of the things that I love about this cheese is that it is a surprise on sometimes when you're getting it. It does have that characteristic change, and I really appreciate that. And today's version of it is honestly one of my favorites because it has not only the nuttiness, but it has that little bit of acidity in there that just really makes it so clean. So what I decided to do is I'm going to pair it up with Bonnie's Jams. And I have this really nice apricot and orange, which plays on the sweet and orange citrus on that, bringing out a little bit of the fruitiness there. I decided to go with the Volpi Coppa, which is, it's dried pork with pepper, nutmeg, and allspice. And then, having a little bit of a cracker to it, chose the Firehook sea salt organic Mediterranean cracker. I just wanted some saltiness in there. And of course, to be able to pair it up with a beer, I chose the local beer, which is Cigar City. And this is their Tocobaga red ale. And, when I first moved here to Tampa 20 years ago, this was my go-to beer. I just adore this. I love red ales. I broke my heart when Pete's Wicked Red went out of business and no longer came available. But, when you're looking at being able to pair this up, you really, that maltiness that you want to bring in there, but with the fruitiness that you get from the jam, the nutmeg, and then the cheese. One of the things that I was concerned about when I did the pairing was that they would all just kind of overpower the cheese. But the beauty of your cheese is that it can stand up so well to all these flavors and merge these, which is really amazing that you get all these great flavors. And, the beer by itself works beautifully with this. This is an IPA style, so it's got a little bit of a citrus note on it. Oh man, is it wonderful on there.
Yeah, I was talking about the interplay of savory and sweet, and that's exactly what you've gone and done with the fruit preserve and the charcuterie. It's Alpine style cheeses are so versatile for that reason. They can play with either side. You're making me thirsty.
Well, this is my dinner. Yeah, all these things here. You don't have to go out and get crazy with the pairings on this cheese. You can use some very simple things because this just pairs up very naturally with fruits and fruitiness of that and the earthiness of the cheese. Now, I do get asked a lot, can you eat the rind?
Mm. Yeah, and in the case of our cheese, yes, you can. If you recall from those earlier slides, the day after the cheese is made, we rub it in dry salt and then begin brushing it in brine. So all of the rind is, on a Pleasant Ridge, the rind is simply dried cheese. So it will have a different texture and a different flavor from the paste, from the interior, but it is still cheese. And at our house, we're, I suppose, spoiled with a lot of cheese. So, but I often don't eat the rind, but we save them and use them in soup stocks. So we just have a clear plastic deli container in the fridge, and after you've cut your cheese, you just go chuck the rinds in the deli container, and then next time you're making the soup stock, drop the rinds in while you're making the stock. Pull them out when you're done. Like you might bone soup bones or bay leaves or something. But there is a lot of flavor in the rind. So even if you don't like eating it fresh, don't throw it out. And it's also, I should mention, a wonderful melting cheese. Just like its old world precedents, Gruyere, Comté, it can form the foundation of fondue, even raclette. But I eat it all the time, melted on eggs in an omelet. The savoriness of the cheese with anything with sautéed onions just is a match made in heaven. Sauté onions and fondue with some little bit of Pleasant Ridge. Doesn't take much. Grated in there can be heavenly.
Yesterday, I did a webinar with IDDBA on change the cheese, you change the recipe. And there's a session in there where I talk about the Swiss cheeses and what you can do with that. And this is a good example of if your recipe comes from or calls for a Swiss cheese, this is an amazing, rich, deep flavored cheese that would add greatness to any recipe. It'll actually be the ingredient that makes that recipe even better than the recipe would be normally. And that's the beauty of being able to change the cheese in a recipe, is by stepping it up to those flavor characteristics. And the creaminess of this 9-month, I've never had one this creamy from you.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'll put you in the creamy
I've had
camp
a
then.
little bit more intense, but the richness and the slight tang on there is magnificent.
Yes. Yeah, the combination of that, the warm richness, and you said that acidity makes your mouth water a little bit. It's yeah, it can be really
That's
compelling.
why you need the beer.
That's why you need a beer. I have my beer fridge is right there. I'm not long for the fridge.
I have a spotted cow, and I thought about that, but
Good man.
I wasn't sure whether or not it'd get kind of lost in the mix with all these flavors. But by itself, I think when I finish this one, I'll probably open up the spotted cow.
Yeah, great. Well, if you ever need some, you let me know. I'll send it down.
All right. Well, you can count on that. I'm down to my last 2 bottles.
Well, this has been great, Michael. Thank you again for including me in your series, and thank you for doing the series. It's great for the whole industry, the cheese community, to have ways to touch each other and talk and keep learning. And I appreciate that you're doing this.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure, and it's always good to see you. I'd really like to have you talk about their victory box, because, obviously this is something that means a lot. The Victory Cheese Box is something that is really helping out a lot of the cheesemakers and farmers across the United States. And you have a magnificent one.
As Michael said, Victory Cheese is a kind of a movement around the country that extends beyond what we're doing. The Victory Cheese Box we're selling is one example of dozens of boxes that are being sold around the country. And the purpose is to draw attention and create sales for particularly small-scale cheesemakers who are struggling because of the pandemic. And so it's borrowing its name, Victory Cheese, from the Victory Gardens of World War II. And the goal was to create a sense of patriotism, or to support small-scale American cheesemakers, because, as the tagline says, choose it or lose it. If some of us small producers, if you don't buy our cheese now, we may not still be in business next time you look in the fall. A lot of us have seen our sales drop precipitously the last few months, and are really struggling. And so the campaign Victory Cheese is hopefully will resonate around the country and help people understand that. And so our particular box combines our cheese, which you saw there, with 2 other cheeses from the Hook family and the Raleigh family. They're both actually on the same road as our farm, just to the south. And close friends, longtime, brothers in arms, really. They are both small family scale cheesemakers. And Chris Raleigh is, the current generation, but I think he's the 4th generation to be making cheese at his family's cheese factory, 100+ years. And Tony Hook and his family, right in the town of Mineral Point to the south of us, have been at it for maybe 40 years, I think. And there's a 10-year cheddar in the box from Hooks. They basically, I think, set the benchmark for long-aged cheddars in the countries, I would say, certainly in Wisconsin. They age some of their cheddars up to 10 or 20 years. The New York Times wrote about their 20-year cheddar a couple of weeks ago. This cheddar is 10 years old, and there's a wedge of that in there. Raleigh's cheese is called Red Rock, and this is a really interesting cheese. It's made like a traditional block cheddar, so in a 40-pound block, but he's added blue mold cultures to the milk, and then at a certain stage during the ripening, pierces the blocks to allow oxygen in, and the blue mold cultures require oxygen to start, uh, you know, creating mold and breaking down the fats and proteins in the cheese to create flavors. So the flavor in the Red Rock is a combination of kind of classic cheddar flavors, a little tart and creamy mouthfeel, with some blue mold type flavors that you find in a blue cheese, kind of an umami, a savoriness and a spiky saltiness. Really interesting cheese. So it's our three cheeses together, and some spiced pecans from a company in Madison, and so a little jar of apple and cranberry preserves. Which, so now, speaking of sweet and savory, the preserves are sweet and tart. The cranberries are really bright, kind of acidic tart fruit. And then the spiced pecans, they have it all. I mean, they're salty, sweet, and savory. They have some, they're I think, traditionally a Spanish product that you'd serve with tapas or something. So it's got some brown sugar in it for sweetness, but also like cayenne and a lot of warm spices. So we're down to less than 50 boxes left on our website. We've been selling them for the last month, and we'll take a breather now. We'll sell through all of them the next couple of days. Take a breather, let other people step to the forefront with their victory cheese boxes. But I expect this movement to continue on for many months. So the thing to do is to go to the website, victorycheese.com, and there is a page on there that will list all the different victory cheese boxes available. And so if you have found your restaurant budget is all of a sudden available, and you want to feel indulgent and give yourself a fun evening at home, buy a victory cheese box, and create some of these fun pairings we've been talking about today. Very affordable, shipped right to your house, and we've all had countless evenings at home, consecutive evenings at home here, and I think this can be a great way to give yourself an evening that feels a little special, and while doing so, support cheesemakers who really need it. And I should also say most of these victory cheese boxes have a philanthropic component, and in our case, 10% of all of our victory cheese box sales are going to our local food pantry, which is more important these days than ever. And so when we're done here and next week selling our victory cheese boxes, I think we'll be sending about $3,000 to the local food pantry. So it's a wonderful thing to get behind, wonderful way to learn about new cheese. Please check it out.
A couple questions, real simple. They wanted to know, have you ever had a batch of cheese that you just said, oh my, no?
Yes, maybe. So I've been here for 13 years. I started as the hired guy, and then bought the farm 6 years ago, took over. 2 or 3, and one was a technical mistake by me. I took a phone call at a certain point during the day, during cheese making, when I shouldn't have. Anyway, we have pigs, not expressly for that purpose. We fatten pigs on whey, which is the liquid byproduct from cheese making. It makes outrageously delicious pork. Which is another kind of part of our business, a small part, but we sell these pigs to restaurants. Some of them we turn into salami and sell on our website over the holidays. But a couple of batches of cheese, yes, that just aren't right and don't come right after aging, will go to the pigs. And um, you've got to be, prepared to do that. Um,
I've had cheesemakers tell me that sometimes in development of trying to get the cheeses, they have some things that just don't work out as well. So they fatten up their pigs for the season.
yes,
So
yes.
the
I mean, especially with cheese making like this, there are a lot of things that have to go right for the cheese to be delicious, but only one or two things that have to go wrong for it to go off track. It's a touchy process.
So one other thing, it was a comment saying that they just went online to buy the victory box and the victory box is sold out. So you're going to have more?
Uh, you know, I would like to, and I think I will, after taking a breather, probably reload and do a new one. Like I said, I would like to give space, especially for other people in Wisconsin, to do some victory cheese boxes. Give sales to some other cheesemakers. We all need it. So there are one or two others available in Wisconsin. I think I will. I can't say for sure, but I've had fun doing it, and I really appreciate it. If any of you listening have ordered, we really appreciate that support, and thank you. But shipping perishable cheese in the heat of July is daunting as well, and so I may wait until the fall. So please check our website again in the fall.
When you are shopping at your local cheese shop or a retailer and you go in there and they do fresh cut cheeses and they don't have this cheese, you need to tell them they need to have that on there and they will bring it in. That's their job, to be able to do that, to be able to make you happy. And that's one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, is that when delis are stocking up, they want to sell cheeses, especially cheeses that have a higher cost to them, want to make sure that they have the right customers for them. So if you're asking for it, you're the right customer for it, and then they're going to be able to bring it in. But what would be surprising, or the happy part, is that they'll bring in more of these cheeses. So it's a good thing. So the thing that I always like to say at the end is to remind everybody that when you are buying a cheese from the producers, from Andy, from any one of these guys, is that you're not just buying a piece of great, magnificent, exceptional, award-winning cheese. You are supporting farmers' families. You're supporting a community. You're really giving other people opportunities to make a living and to live, thrive, and survive in this pandemic. And it's really important that you support them. And this is a great way. Just because the victory box is gone doesn't mean that you can't order his cheese. You can order as much as you want. He'll sell you wheels. There's an unlimited amount that you can order online. So don't be afraid. He'll pack extra ice in it.
You bet. That's true. Please, send me an email or go onto our website. We'd be happy to send you some of this delicious August Pleasant Ridge. And of course, as Michael said, and I should have, support your local cheese shops. They too are struggling through this. And if they don't have our cheese, please remind them that they can get it. It is available all over the country, and that you'd like them to bring it in. So thank you for that, Michael.
Sure. Well, when you're in that vein and supporting local businesses, when you're supporting somebody local, you're taking care of their family and your own community as well. But the cheese has to get there. So you're supporting a salesperson, you're supporting a distributor, you're supporting truckers, you're supporting an entire chain of people that be able to bring that and other cheeses to you when you go out to buy a cheese. So, you know, buying online is wonderful because you'll support directly. But if you have an opportunity to be able to buy from a retailer, please take that opportunity and do that. And thank them for their love and dedication during this time of bringing those cheeses to you.
Yes, well said. Thank you.
All right. So, Andy, anything else you'd like to say before we head out here?
Uh, I think you said it so well. Please, you know, whether you're ordering from home or you're out and about again, support American cheese producers. It's a really important part of certainly where I live, our countryside, and we need your support now more than ever. So, and we appreciate it. So, thank you, and thanks for tuning in and listening today. If you have other questions, I'm pretty easy to get to. Just Andy@uplandscheese.com, or go through our website, and please stay in touch.
If there's anything that you can't get a hold of him, reach out to me. You have my email address from the registration, and I'll be happy to get you two together. So we'll keep this going, and we certainly appreciate that. So there's more to come. If you are on the mail list, you found out that I booked 16 more of these in July, and there's an entire crop coming up in August now. So going to keep going on Wednesday, Thursdays, and Fridays for the rest of the time. I'm actually going to take next week off. It's been a little busy, so that. But this will be on my YouTube channel, Michael Landis Cheese. So you can share this and order his cheese and play along. All right. So Andy, good to see you, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Michael. Thanks again. Bye, everybody.
Bye. I want to take this moment to thank the Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin for sponsoring this segment. And for those of you, I want to thank you again for taking the time to be able to sit down with Andy and myself and really enjoy his story. So thank you very much. Have a very safe time. And remember, wash your hands.